Hello. As I mentioned, my name is Kathy Malcolm Edwards, and I have a few housekeeping items to share with you before we begin our panel discussion. The Canadian Accessibility Network is a national collaboration under the leadership of the Accessibility Institute at Carleton University. We often call it CAN, C-A-N. CAN aims to advance accessibilities for persons with disabilities in Canada. If you or your organization are not yet a part of our network, I encourage you to connect with us and join our network to advance accessibility across Canada. While we endeavor to provide forward-facing supports in both official languages, the event today will be delivered in English. However, captioning is both English and French, and ASL interpretation will be available throughout the event so that you can follow along in your preferred language. Introducing our ASL interpreters is always a really good reminder for myself and for all of us to try and speak at an even, moderate pace, not too quickly, so that they can capture everything that is being said. Any attendee who indicated that they require ASL while registering for this event has been given multi-pin privileges so that you can pin each of the ASL interpreters' videos. Pinning highlights their video on your individual screen. We'll also be spotlighting our interpreters' videos throughout the event today, and we'll do our best to ensure the active interpreters are always on screen. Captioning is available through Zoom. You can enable subtitles within Zoom by clicking on the up arrow that's right next to the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can also view subtitles via external links that will be shared in the chat. If you cannot see the captions or you encounter any other technical issue during the session, please don't hesitate to put a comment in the chat and a member of our event support team will do their best to help you. And for those joining via phone, you can use *6 to mute, unmute, and *9 to raise lower hand. Our last housekeeping note, for those who use a screen reader or a voiceover support, we've been made aware that commentary and activity in the chat can be distracting and actually take away from our speakers. It is for this reason that we've adjusted the chat settings today, and you will only be able to chat directly with our event support team. But don't worry, they're monitoring the chat. They're keeping an eye out for questions and relevant comments. So thank you for your understanding. So as I promised, I will give a more fulsome introduction of myself right now. My name is Kathy Malcolm Edwards. I use pronouns she, her. I am a middle-aged woman with medium-length blonde brown hair, and today I am wearing blue glasses. I also identify as having both apparent and non-apparent disabilities. I'm very, very privileged to be able to lead the accessibility strategy for Carleton University, and I do this as a member of the Accessibility Institute at Carleton. We're here today to talk about implementing and measuring accessibility progress. Ensuring accessibility is crucial, but knowing how to measure and improve it can be even more of a challenge. So we have a really exciting group of panelists here today, and I'd like to invite them to introduce themselves. So we'll start with a quick round of introductions, and I'd love to hear more about each of you. So if you could give a quick share about who you are and maybe what drew you to this conversation today, I would really appreciate it. So I'd like to start with Mandy Crespo.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mandy. I am the National Accessibility Leader at BDO Canada. I use pronouns she and her. I'm a white, I hate to say middle-aged, but 41-year-old with about shoulder-length brown hair, and I'm wearing a white blazer and a black shirt underneath today. I come to this conversation with lots of experience working directly with organizations across Canada in first assessing where they are on accessibility, developing accessibility plans, developing progress reports, and also implementing change and removing barriers over time. And so after doing this for years, I've learned a lot about what is working or isn't working at different types of organizations, and wanted to be here today to share some of what I've learned.
Thank you so much, Mandy. It sounds like you really are working across the entirety of a spectrum when it comes to looking at accessibility in organizations.
Absolutely, which is the fun part. Yep, you get
Yeah,
something different every time.
exactly.
Yep.
I would like to now ask Matthew to introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you today. My name is Matthew Shaw. I describe my work as an accessibility practice, which is using the viewpoint, strategies, and tools of accessibility and the disability experience as a way to create value. And that can mean economic and social value, and we're in private institutions. It can mean public social value. It can mean how do we remove barriers so that everyone we wish to engage with is able to engage and participate in that fully. So I've had the pleasure of working with organizations across a number of industries and sectors. I'm today focusing a lot of my work in the nonprofit world and the standards and legislative and policy environments that are here in Canada and around the world. And helping people understand that since everything we do is mediated through our bodies and minds, why on earth would we create anything that doesn't respond or understand that fundamental principle? So I'm so excited to be here with all of my panelists and to be part of CAN and looking forward to a great chat.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It's so important to for us to heed that call to action that you've already started us on, which is fantastic. And last, I would like to ask Amber Knobel to introduce themselves as well.
Thanks, Kathy. Hi, everyone. Amber Knobel here. I am based out of Toronto, and I, for full-time work, work at Fable, have for the last 6 years. My role has evolved quite a lot over the last number of those years. And what really excites me the most about working on the strategy arm in particular is that I get to work with both public and private sector clients on really effectively arming them with the tools that they need to include people with disabilities as part of their product development processes. Outside of Fable, I am also a co-lead for CAN and the Research Design and Innovation Community of Practice, which is always great. We get to have exciting conversations like this many times a year, which has been a real treat as well. So looking forward to bringing some of that workplace knowledge and experience alongside what I've learned a lot from others here at CAN to the conversation today.
Thank you so much, Amber. You bring up a really good point that CAN has this ability to look cross-sector as well, and you're doing that within your role. And bringing those different perspectives to the table is a big part of how we're going to be able to advance accessibility, I think. So thank you for sharing that. So now I'd like to get us started with the panel discussion. So I'm really excited that we are going to be having this time together. And to kick it off, I would like to start with you, Mandy, if you don't mind. In looking at what are some of the most effective tools and metrics that you've used to measure the impact of accessibility initiatives?
Yeah, and I've been thinking about that question, and it's kind of two parts. We have different tools, and also what metrics do we use. And first, I'll just say it goes right in line with accessibility. It is never one size fits all. I've been in organizations like somewhere like like TELUS or a Canadian Tire that's huge, have many different moving parts, and there are so many different types of tools that they already have, and different metrics that they're already using. And so it's how to expand on that and use what they already have. I also work with some organizations that have like 4 people, and so they have very different access and very different needs than a huge organization. So I would say first, of wherever you're at in your processes, for those of you that are watching this or listening to this, wherever you're at is okay. I just tell you that first. If you're currently measuring nothing, or if you currently have a little bit that you're doing, that's okay. The most important thing I would say is where starting. It's starting somewhere. As far as tools, I've seen organizations that want things really simple. They want to use a document and just make a list. They use Excel spreadsheets, and then they put different columns where they have what action they want to take, what quarter they plan on taking the action, who is assigned to that action. So I've seen that. We've also worked with organizations that use project management tools like Asana or Trello, Microsoft Planner for people that are in the Microsoft ecosystem. Some are very fancy and have Power BI interactive dashboards, which is the coolest, or like Google Data Studio that has free options that tie to Google Analytics. So there's a lot of different tools out there. So first, I would just say look for what's around you or what you have access to, what you've used before, and think about who needs to access it. Is it just you tracking, or do multiple people need to be able to access this tool? So you can kind of decide what works best for you. And metrics really quickly. I'll just say a few things, and then maybe Amber or Matthew want to add. Again, it depends on I've been working with a lot of organizations around complying with the Accessible Canada Act, or the still the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or Accessible British Columbia Act. So it depends on if you are regulated and you need to meet certain criteria, or if you're not. But I would say some of the things that we've started with for organizations that have no tracking right now are first having a list of actions they're taking, putting what they've completed, what percentage they've completed towards removing different actions, or towards removing different barriers. For some legislation, you have to have a feedback mechanism. And so tracking that feedback, how much feedback did you get over time? How quickly did you resolve any kind of feedback or barriers that people encountered? And then also, depending on the legislation, there's also things like maybe you're tracking certain points within employment. How many people with disabilities are you employing? Are they getting promoted? How many are leaving your organization? Or things like your website. Maybe you're looking at how many errors related to accessibility are there right now on your website, and how quickly are you resolving those errors? So there are a lot of options, and I would just say don't try to do everything all at once. Start somewhere, start small, work your way up over time, and just do something that allows you to have continuity, where you can say, we're going to get foundational data, we're going to build on that, or we're going to survey people every year, we're going to just keep getting better and better with our tracking over time. I see, Amber, did you have something to add? I think you unmuted.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on some really important points there. Definitely in terms of Starting where you are. I think a lot of the times, folks that I'm working with, they'll come with a big lofty goal. They have their sights set on becoming 100% compliant or 100% accessible. But really understanding the bigger picture when it comes to the different efforts of work that go into that, right? And I find that when I'm working with organizations, and this is something that we've seen a lot of success at Fable, is really breaking it down in terms of people, process, and product. So that's not a new concept in terms of how we look at organizational change, but knowing that to get to that goal, we have to think about those three different buckets, if you will, and what you're doing within those buckets to date. So how knowledgeable are your teams right now in terms of fixing accessibility issues and barriers, which you touched on? We're looking at, are we seeing any trends in terms of the number of accessibility issues? Are they increasing over time or are they decreasing over time? And lastly, and what I would argue is most important, depending on the sector that you're in, what are your customers or your users, your people with disabilities that are touching your products and services saying about your programs or products? Um, I find that when we take that step back, it helps us to really understand what more granular and tactical metrics are going to be the most meaningful for people. And to Mandy, to your point, you might not be tracking some of these things right now. And so that's going to be the first step. It's let's put in a process to make sure that we are actually tracking these things because I can't actually answer that question right now. So yeah, definitely a lot of parallels there and some great points. Matthew, I'm not sure if you've had similar experiences with your work.
Yeah, very, very resonant, very much birds of a feather. I mean, I know we're talking today specifically about measurement, but maybe even just as a quick note, a preemptory is that goals, metrics, and how we report on them are, of course, all kind of the three amigos, right? And what we're doing when we're talking about the measurement is we're trying to collect and gather our data points and look at what qualitative and quantitative evidence do we have that we are making progress towards our accessibility goals and whatever they may be. And so one of the funny dynamics of this is that there's lots of things you can measure. Not all of them are directing you towards the outcomes that you want. One of the cruel ironies is getting better at doing the wrong thing makes you wronger, not righter. And so if we're collecting that kind of information, we don't understand how it connects to the goal. Then we really miss an opportunity. So one of the points that I always try to remind people of, particularly when they're beginning with a compliance mindset, is focus on what is your objective as an organization or an industry? Like, what are your goals and what are the performance indicators that would matter to you in your line of work? And how would you know that you're being successful? That can provide a framework for your accessibility initiatives to tie into your overall goal and destination vis-a-vis your compliance or regulatory obligations, which are still very important, but we can end up measuring all kinds of things, and we're missing what's really fundamental to the work that to the work that we're doing. And so I always encourage people to adopt some simpler key performance indicators and to track and measure with their goal in mind and kind of develop a long-term approach. I'm sure I'd be curious to hear Mandy and Amber. I get sent a lot of accessibility plans and reports, and after a while, they start to read the image I get in my head is of the artwork that's outside my child's grade school classroom, which is they're all filling in the same forms and templates, and they're putting the information in of what people think is expected or to want to show that the work is being done. But they're still early in their understanding of how this actually drives a result, i.e., the removal of a barrier or towards their goal. And so rather than, reaching beyond their grasp, is to really develop develop a what are the metrics that matter most? What are the things that we think we would tell us if we're getting closer to the right goal or not, and how that aligned with the strategy, and just trying to simplify it.
I have to say, Matthew and Amber, you both kind of made the same point, and I totally agree that it's sometimes people are just working towards compliance, and they just like you think of like AODA in Ontario, and you have to provide training. People have to be trained on accessibility, and it's a checkbox where you go, yes, we've tracked it. Everyone in our organization has taken training, but it's a very different thing to go, was this training valuable? Did it reduce ableism in our workforce and in our employees? So there's very different metrics that you can set depending on, are you just trying to meet those compliance obligations, or are you trying to enact change in your organization for persons with disabilities?
Very good point. I really appreciate you highlighting that, Mandy. And I'm wondering if maybe from there I can go to you, Matthew, and ask, with this context in mind that the three of you have shared so far, can you maybe share a success story that illustrates how tracking accessibility progress has led to improvements in an organization?
I think fundamentally it is beginning with what's the goal and then setting a kind of the right scale in mind. So we often default towards, especially if we're taking an AODA or Accessible Canada Act mindset and we're going with compliance, for example, is we'll look at what's required of the act. We'll try to be as detailed as possible, and maybe we'll try to embed this in a big picture commitment, and we're going to kind of boil the ocean. Um, in my experience, the most successful approaches are to begin with the bottom and to work their way up. And so one approach that can be useful before or alongside a wider organizational reporting strategy would be to look at your data collection from an individual or a team or function level, and then working your way up. One of my common points of advice to organizations and teams is solve a problem for an end user now and find the simplest one that you can solve, and then put that in your handbook, or put that in your in the back of your mind, and then learn how to replicate that and then track those challenges. So starting from the small point of view and working your way bigger can help you avoid can help you avoid your data collection subtly biasing itself not towards your outcomes that you want, but towards your ability to satisfy compliance. I sometimes tell organizations, like if you're a publicly traded company and you're choosing, and you're an investor and you're choosing where to park your investment money, the compliance obligations of the Securities and Exchange Commission is just part of it's the table stakes. It's everybody that's on your list of potential companies to invest in has already met those criteria. You're looking for something more. So it's the same thing when it comes to the accessibility, your accessibility data collection and reporting. I think one thing that I would mention is, in addition to choosing the scale, one of the things that can be really useful is let's measure and capture data that is upstream rather than downstream. So if we're trying to make some strategic changes to our culture or to our organization, some of the problems or solutions or data that we're going to want to make progress toward are happening at a different stage in the cycle. And so having the right teams and units be engaged in this can be really useful. An example of a client that I worked with, they were very interested in understanding how consumers with disabilities would use their products in the future, and they built a long-term forecasting model, and they were really interested in how are they using their products today and what would that mean for future design decisions. Now, if they do that well and they capture their data points well, then the customer service team that's handling the angry phone calls from the product are never going to get those calls. They're never going to have the metrics to solve for it. So just really being thoughtful and intentional, whatever your org's structure and style and objectives are, and just say, where should we plant our first flag on this can be a really useful way to getting some traction.
Thank you, Matthew. Amber, do you have anything to add?
Oh yeah, definitely. I think some great points there, Matthew, for sure. I think what you touched on about the cross functionality of it all is a really, really important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about sustainability. And I think what we see oftentimes are people coming with a very reactive approach. And again, kind of what I was alluding to in the initial question around metrics, how can we help folks see that this actually, for long-term success, we need to be thinking more proactively. So sure, we can work towards making sure that all of your products and legacy products and services are compliant today. But what are the training and operational aspects that we're going to introduce to make sure that the next time you update it or you experience turnover or whatever organizational change you face, you're going to be covered in the longer term to make sure that you're not introducing net new issues and you won't find yourself in the same position 6 months, 12 months, and beyond down the road. So I think it's definitely a yes and exercise. You know, we can do the checkbox exercise, but let's also think about how we're going to prevent some of these things from happening in the future and the people and the processes that we need in place to really make sure that all this work will not be for nothing down the line. And I think that those conversations are really important to have early on to highlight just how many different people need to be on board for organizations to succeed. And I think you touched on that as well, Matthew, as you know, making sure that everyone's aware of the different people that we need on board for this initiative. And that's definitely where we've seen a lot of success in coaching organizations on the bigger picture of all of this work.
I see you shaking nodding your head, Mandy.
Yeah, no, so I had two things go through my head as you were talking, Amber. One is so at BDO, we did a full accessibility assessment of ourselves 2 years ago, and our team did of the entire BDO Canada, and we one of the things we said is we need data on how many persons with disabilities are employed at BDO, so we have a sense of what services we need to provide and how we're doing. We need feedback. And when we went to try to create better avenues for getting this data, we realized that we our definitions of disability, the way we were collecting information was out of date. And so before we could even begin collecting data, we changed our data collection model and changed what types of data we collected. And so that means it's harder to connect to what we were doing in the past. The data they had on persons with disabilities at the firm before will be different from now. But at least now we know the data we are collecting from here on out actually much better reflects the persons with disabilities that are employed at BDO. So I think that was a great point, Amber. First, sometimes you just have to take a step back and go, what data are we going to collect over the long term, and let's make sure that we are collecting the right thing now, even if that means changing,
Mhm.
and shifting what we're doing in order to set us up for the long term and have good data over time.
I
So
think that's
that's
a
the
really,
first thing I thought.
yeah.
Yeah, the second thing was we just created a new accessibility training for all of BDO. It will be released in a few weeks, and I realized the feedback questions we're asking at the end, I need to change some of those. So that was the other thing. So thank you all. This is a great conversation for me to put my money where my mouth is and and go, we need to fix that. It's not good enough.
I think that employment example, Mandy, is super interesting. And I think that paints a nice picture for folks on the line as well of the evolution of the data that you need and where your focus will go. Because now you have that data of, yes, we're able to employ people with disabilities successfully. But then, you might evolve that into retaining. How long are folks staying with BDO? Are they feeling fulfilled and finding the right roles at BDO and set up for success with your internal processes and tools and all of those important factors as well. So I think that's a really excellent example of, again, just meeting your organization where you're at, collecting, your first step of data, and then being okay evolving that over time is an important call out for sure.
Matthew.
Just to, yeah, just one of the things and I think this is of a feather with both of your comments. One of the things I try to say when organizations are really thinking about this is the removal of barriers is a vital activity. But I encourage them to think of the accessibility in their data collection as evaluating a skill set, which is their ability to be responsive, and to grow in their understanding and knowledge and for their data to become progressively more sophisticated. So if we think of any activity that we learn how to do and we read the instructions for the first time or somebody tells us for the first time, it's not going to be the same set of instructions or indicators that an absolute expert would have. If you're teaching a child to kick a ball or swing a bat or to draw a picture, is the steps that they would follow are not necessarily the same steps that Pablo Picasso or Wayne Gretzky would use if they were describing the breakdown of those skill sets. So having it be at a scale and resolution that they can use, and that you can kind of actually measure yourself, just like what Mandy was saying about the work at BDO is like we have to kind of do an honest assessment of our current skills and kind of at a level and resolution that's like useful for us, right? Versus some arbitrary or view of what we think we have to do because of what an outside organization has asked us.
I think one of the things, a thread that I'm hearing throughout this conversation so far as well, has to do with the importance of feedback. It seems to have come up in each one of yours, where and feedback from users, I think, has been the word as well that's been uh, has been used, so to speak. Can you say a little bit more about that role of feedback?
I mean, you don't know what you don't know, and certain folks might have lived experience that they're not quite being called on to share, or perhaps it's not something that they feel safe to be sharing as well. So I think, collecting feedback from the communities whom you're trying to serve is just critical. And, it is the core of the Accessible Canada Act as well. So I think it's no longer what was previously perceived as a nice to have to some organizations. Now it's just the right way to do this type of work. And it's invaluable for a few different reasons. I think in terms of priorities, that's really where that feedback is going to help your initiatives excel, because as we've just shared, there's a number of different ways that you can tackle this very large challenge of removing barriers for people with disabilities. But what does that community want us to prioritize first? There's always going to be more we can do and ways that we can improve, but it will help us to really focus our efforts on where we can have the biggest impact in the shortest amount of time. I think that's whether you're talking about a digital product, you're talking about a service, you're talking about employment. I think that rings true across all of those different categories. Mandy, Matthew, curious your thoughts on that.
We have to keep short thoughts on it.
Oh,
So, because I have thrown us off book here. I went off book with a question. So maybe we can come back to that. I do want to continue the conversation though, Amber, with what some of the common challenges are that organizations maybe face when they're implementing and tracking accessibility measures, and how might they overcome? I know we've given some examples when you're talking about success stories, but what are those challenges and how do they overcome them?
yeah, I think again, this will depend, but the most common ones that I've seen for sure, leadership buy-in. So buy-in to actually put investment, time, money, resources behind this work is definitely the one that sticks out. I think this one, again, it will depend on the leadership team that you're working with and how decisions are made. But what I've found is that combining, and Matthew, you touched on this earlier, a mix of qualitative and quantitative data and feedback. Again, this is going to need to include stories of people to really help leadership understand why this is a non-negotiable, whether that's due to regulatory commitments that you have, whether that's to market opportunity in front of us. Again, that talk track, if you will change depending on the sector that you're in. But those are going to be the story that will help you not only understand why this is a smart business decision, but also help build up some empathy and awareness and some education along the way. So I think that combination is really, really important versus just leading with, well, we are a regulatory body and this is what we need to be doing. You can help some of those trickle down conversations by really raising some additional awareness on the topic. The other thing that I've seen success with is get involved with a really high profile project and to get accessibility injected into that project. The approach there is really about helping to dispel the myth that working on accessibility is time consuming or it slows projects down or folks need a very specific skill set to do this properly, and use that as a case study, if you will, to shop around internally and say, look at this high profile product, feature, service, whatever it may be. And these were the requirements that we built in from the top, and this is the success that we had. I think using that to just set a really nice example helps again to cultivate that buy-in in the short and longer term.
Wow. Bringing up empathy is something very close to my heart. Mandy, Matthew, anything to add?
Yeah, I had a few more to add of challenges that I've seen. One is having a tool that not everyone can access. So if you have maybe a tool where you have actions that HR needs to take and people in facilities need to take and communications need to take, but only one person owns that document or spreadsheet and no one else has access. It's not top of mind for anyone else. If there's no set touch points and collaboration around that tracking, it tends to fall to the wayside. So there has to be some consistency with that collaboration over time. Another one is not breaking things into manageable pieces. It can be very overwhelming if your goal is to become fully accessible. It's much easier to say, okay, we know we've got this specific barrier. In Q1, we're going to make this much progress. Well, and then after that, we're going to work on this piece of making progress. So if you can break things into smaller pieces over time and track your progress on those pieces, that tends to help you, especially when you're in this long game like we all are. Um, you need to have some wins. And so the best way to do that is have something where you're tracking these wins and demonstrating to people who say, yes, we're not there yet, but here's what we've done. Look at all these great things. So I think it's really helpful to motivate people if we track that progress in smaller pieces.
Matthew.
We're getting in here to, we're getting into the reality of like what it's like on the ground when we're in organizations and we're in roles, and there are all of these other wins and goals that are buffeting the organization around, and we're trying to figure out how do we bring these metrics as because we know that we're valuable, and how do we kind of introduce them into this kind of wider environment that we're in. And, we all know what a lot of those barriers could be. The idea that this is a compliance obligation, that this is a cost and a liability rather than an asset or a revenue generator. This becomes into, oh, now we're adding on to people's skills or people's plates. We're adding more work. We kind of know what many of the common objections are. If we're going to try to instill some stable, basic data and evaluation criteria and kind of say, how do I best embark on this within the organization? I love Amber's suggestion around finding that high profile project or something that the organization's already excited about. You don't have to generate excitement for the initiative, and you're not adding anything negative to it. You're saying, wonderful. While we do this, we're going to look at A, B, and C and track that in the metrics. Is that cool? And then use that as a kind of way to get the kids to eat their vegetables without realizing that it's getting going. Um, I think one of the other barriers is a reluctance to hear the truth from the customer. If you're a startup, you will live or die on your ability to listen to your customer and revise your offering to meet their needs. There are lots of industries, though, where we're really buffeted or like have a big border between us and the client, and it's not fun to get negative information about, our accessibility progress or things like that. I think one of the things that's really important is the better your feedback mechanism and the easier it is, and the more that you have some people on that team that are willing to engage, i.e., actually ask people in different forms, like for their feedback, the better your data points are going to be. One of the ways that can help kind of start to build that case towards adoption of broader metrics is actually have the feedback mechanism and try to get some good real life feedback from real people. And then also try to find what are some of the wins around the organization. It can be a department, it can be one person, it can be one interaction, and collect those stories so that at the point where you really want to start to encourage adoption of this, maybe you have followed Amber's strategy of bringing some metrics into a project. You've started quietly collecting and implementing a low stress feedback mechanism while nobody's really paying attention and collecting those insights. And you've got a couple of stories in your back pocket of where somebody on the team has solved a win. And then that can help really kind of pitch and persuade the story among other stakeholders and C-suite and so on, where we're all concerned with all of these other things that are kind of, that are in the air all around us. So
I have one thing. I know we're getting to the end, but I want to add one thing I just thought of too was um, I just wanted to remind people to pay attention to barriers within your data collection process. If you're doing surveys, make sure those surveys are accessible to people, offer multiple ways to provide feedback. whether it's in person or it's anonymous or it's in writing, or make sure you're meeting people where they're at and with what they're most comfortable and able to do to provide feedback as well, because it might be that it might not be that you are have a perfect product or service, but it might be that people just are not able to provide feedback because of your barriers in your feedback mechanism. So just wanted to say, pay attention to that as well.
And I take from that, I can hear it, just having done some work with Amber and stuff as well, user testing, user testing. Is so important, getting that feedback before you launch.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important point, Mandy, because the data can work against, folks like us who are trying to drive this if those barriers are in place. So ruling that out from the top, I think is a very important point to bring up.
I can't believe how quickly the time has flown so far. This has been such an exceptional discussion. My only frustration is moderating. It's hard to also take notes at the same time, and I'm just like, I'm going to be going back and watching this for sure. Now's the time for question and answer. So if anyone has any questions or comments for our panelists, I would invite you to type them in the chat, and I'll then read them out to the panelists. If you require ASL interpretation to ask a question or share a comment, please raise your hand and we will spotlight your video and invite you to sign your question. For any attendee who's joining over the phone, the controls you can use to interact with us are *9 to raise and lower your hand, *6 to mute or unmute yourself. So one question that has been brought to us is, do any of the panelists here have experience with or use of global diversity, equity, inclusion benchmarks? This is a first for me. I have personally not heard of them, but has anybody been doing any work with those?
A broader comment on the use of aligning reporting to global benchmarks, and it can be a variety of different contexts. We of course have WCAG for digital. We have the UN and ESG goals, and we have an emerging body of DEI practices. One of the things I see happen a fair bit is the introduction or adoption of those key metrics when the organization's evaluation maturity level is pretty low. So it's kind of like trying to do a really complex, I'll use my earlier analogy, a really complex hockey move or drawing, and not having the ability to fulfill on it. And so one of the things it can do is it can tilt our bias from what is the customer or the person that's a part of our community, what are they telling me and how am I responding to it, to positioning our body of work within a global best practice. And that ultimate goal may be very noble and worthy, but it can create a kind of analysis paralysis, or we start looking in the wrong direction in terms of what it is we're measuring and why. I know that's not a direct answer to that question, but that's one of the things I would say generally to when we're looking at kind of global standards and benchmarks for organizations, just to be careful of, so they don't go from one end of the seesaw, which is maybe we're not doing anything, to all of a sudden we completely tilt. And what's kind of guiding our action is not directly the people we serve, but a kind of um, broader standard or best practice organization.
I think that understanding of organizational maturity is so important. Mandy, Amber, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think our approach historically, and Mandy, you touched on this earlier, of really trying to understand the metrics that people are measuring today. And something that we found in the digital product space in particular, and the UX side of the equation, is that folks were very often using a metric called SUS, or the System Usability Scale, to measure usability. What we quickly found throughout that process was that this SUS wasn't very applicable when it came to the experiences of people with disabilities who are using assistive technology. So we came up with an adapted SUS, which is our accessible usability scale score. And what that allows folks to do is, again, focus on what they care about, which is the usability of their products on a globally respected metric like SUS, but make sure that it's painting that full picture. And it was some minor tweaks in terms of language, but we saw big impact in terms of how not only how our organizations were able to adopt this into their existing workflows, but how the experiences of people with disabilities were being better reflected as part of that process. So I think it's hyper specific in terms of product quality, but an example nonetheless of what we've done in the past.
I think your example perfectly highlights what I was going to say, which is you have to put it through your own lens of going, is this relevant? Are these metrics, is what they're asking on a global scale, is this relevant in our context? And also going, what is this missing? Because sometimes you look at it and you go, okay, I've taken out what's not relevant, but then think about what do I need to add in that is relevant to us, that is not relevant at this larger global level that's trying to encompass the entire world. So sometimes it's not specific enough to your context. So think both, what do you need to take away? What do you need to add, if anything, to make it relevant to your particular environment?
Mandy, while I have you on the mic, I have a question specifically for you.
Oh man.
Um,
Okay.
so how did you change the data collection to collect, as you said, the right information? Can you give us an example of a data collection format or questions that you maybe had changed?
Um, so we realized the data we were collecting was very much based on the medical model of disability, and it did not include things like temporary or episodic disability. There was no room for that within the statistics we were collecting. So we changed. We adopted the social model of disability, changed our definition of disability to be in line with the Accessible Canada Act, even though we're not federally regulated. And then we also, of course, looked at the Employment Equity Act and made sure we still aligned with that and the information we needed to collect for that. But then we were just very intentional, like looking at the Statistics Canada and the way that they collect data on disability. And we know that their data, as they clearly say on their website, in order to retain consistency, they've kept intact some older definitions of disability than they would like to. But so we took that into consideration. We went, we're not tied to this old model of collecting data. So we started out by saying, this is our definition of disability, and it's based on the social model. Go, at this time, do you identify as someone with a disability? And so it gave more people the opportunity to go, oh, this is different than what we had in the past. Yes, I do identify as a person with a disability, where based on that old medical model, I did not fit into that survey. So that was the first change we made. And then we just did more looking at intersectionality on disability. We didn't have any questions related to intersectionality before. So we did more questions based on that, so we could really understand where the firm is experiencing the largest barriers and who is experiencing those barriers. So we both are collecting data on how many people identify as having a disability, where those identities intersect, but then also collecting information on the barriers they're experiencing and trying to tie that into the data as well.
Thank you so much for that. And we have more questions than we have time, which is a good and a bad problem to have. I think I'm going to go with the last one. Is Does the panel have any good resources for maybe measuring accessibility from the bottom up? Maybe starting points in terms of what people can use, something tangible that then we can maybe also share with others. Anyone?
Yeah, definitely have resources that we can share from Fable's perspective as well, things we've seen that have worked well from that KPI standpoint, as well as more information on the accessible usability scale score, which if you are a UX practitioner would be definitely one that you would find to be valuable. If folks are interested in getting a bit of support, building that business case or those types of things, I've got some resources to share on that side of things. Kathy, I don't think if I drop things in this chat, it will make its way to the group, but perhaps we can do a bit of a roundup after the session.
Exactly. I was going to say that it's wonderful to hear that there are tools available. And I think what we can do is send those to CAN, and then those can be shared with those that registered for the call today. Because I think people are, especially in this time of, we're all facing a lot of budgetary constraints and yet also passionate and wanting to bring things forward. That people are eager to have those tangible tools that might be able to help us in our everyday practice.
Yeah, I think Kathy, it could be, I know for certain there's a few interesting projects from community of practices within CAN that maybe it would be a good time to shine a light on some of that work
Perfect.
as well. So we can definitely share a list.
Well, thank you so much for that. As I mentioned, we weren't able to get to all the questions, but maybe what we can do is we can follow up with our panelists after and get some responses that we can then share with the community that's here today that registered. I want to thank you everyone for attending today, for your comments and your questions, and my goodness, thank you to our panelists for your just insightful contributions, for sharing your expertise. It has been such a great discussion. I personally have found it really useful and have a lot of reflection to do. I'm hopeful that the organizations that were represented today have gained insights that will be able to be put into practice. So thank you for joining us today. We'll also be sharing a link to our feedback form in the chat and ask that you take a moment to fill it out to keep us developing and improving these events. If you have any questions or want information about getting involved in CAN, please do not hesitate to reach out to the national office at CAN, that's CAN, at Carleton, CARLETON.ca. We'll share this email address in the chat as well. We hope to see you all at our next CAN Connect forum, and in the meantime, have a great afternoon or a great morning, depending what part of the country you're joining us from. And we will see you at the next forum. Thank you again.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Kathy, for facilitating the discussion.